Say it again, I said, my voice steady even though my hands weren't. My sister Emily was crying into my father's shoulder like she was the one being attacked. Her shoulders shook in those perfect little waves I had seen her use since childhood. I saw the transfer, Emily sobbed. She took the money. She thinks we wouldn't notice. My father still hadn't looked at me. He stood with his hand on Emily's back, rubbing slow circles like she was 5 and had scraped her knee. His jaw was tight. His silence said everything. Then he finally turned, and his eyes were cold in a way that made my stomach drop. You stole from this family, he said. The room went quiet first. Then murmurs started. Aunt Carol pressed her lips together and shook her head. My cousin Trey looked at the floor. Uncle Warren crossed his arms and stared at me like the verdict was already in. Then my father added one more thing, flat and calm. We have proof. I didn't flinch. I didn't cry. I stood there and let the weight of that sentence fill the room. Because I already knew exactly what was coming. And I had been waiting for it. My name is Hannah Cole. I am 32 years old. I work remotely as a financial operations consultant. I help mid-sized companies organize billing systems, track contractor payments, and fix paperwork that most businesses ignore until it causes a real crisis. I am good at it, very good, though nobody in my family would ever say that. To them, I am the difficult one. The daughter who never got it together. The one who didn't marry early like Emily, didn't stay local, didn't sit at Sunday dinners laughing at my father's same 3 jokes. I moved 3 hours away at 25 and built a life that looked small from the outside because most of it was invisible. Paid my own bills. Asked for nothing. I tracked numbers the way some people breathe. Automatically, without thinking. That part of me, the quiet and careful and documented part, they never counted as strength. They called it coldness. They called it distance. They said I thought I was better than everyone. But that same version of me, the one they had dismissed for years, was the version they were about to meet. They had absolutely no idea what I had been quietly keeping track of. Our family had a structure everyone understood but nobody discussed. My father, James Cole, led everything. He was loud when that served him and silent when that worked better. He had run a small hardware distribution business for 20 years and carried that manager energy into every room, including the living room. When James spoke, people nodded. Emily was 3 years younger than me and had always been the one my father softened for. She cried easily, smiled easily, and knew exactly which words made him lower his guard. She used them like a key since childhood, without effort, without thinking. Emily married at 24, had 2 kids by 28, and lived 15 minutes from my father's house. She came to every Sunday dinner. She called on every birthday. Then there was Aunt Carol, my father's younger sister, who smoothed things over and changed the subject whenever tension crept in. She never challenged my father directly because that simply wasn't how she survived in this family. And me. I was the one they tolerated. Invited because leaving me out would look bad. Called when something needed fixing, then forgotten once it was handled. What none of them understood was how much had quietly needed fixing. And who had always been doing it. The accusation spread through the family the way fire moves through dry grass, fast and careless. By the time I heard the full version, it had been shaped and repeated enough times that people treated it as established fact. The family had a shared emergency account, set up 3 years earlier when my father had a health scare and wanted a financial cushion multiple people could reach quickly. Emily had access. My father had access. It was meant for one purpose only. According to Emily, she had checked the balance that week and found it far lower than expected. She pulled transaction records, saw transfers over several months, cross-referenced the timing with my account access, and reached one conclusion. She told my father I had been draining it. People believed her instantly. They repeated things like, the money is gone, and it lines up with her access, as if those 2 facts together constituted proof. My father told Aunt Carol. Aunt Carol mentioned it to Uncle Warren. And by the time I was called to come over on Sunday, everyone had already decided how the story ended. I didn't argue. because I knew something none of them had bothered to verify. That account, the one they claimed I had stolen from, I was the one who had been keeping it alive. Not once, not occasionally, consistently, month after month, for just over 2.5 years. The first time I added money was the spring after it opened. My father's business had a slow quarter and there was a gap between income and expenses. He mentioned it casually mid-conversation. The account's looking thin. I transferred money the next morning without making it a topic. The second time was 4 months later. Then again after that. It became a quiet pattern, invisible and never discussed, because in my family, the things I did were only mentioned when they could be criticized, never when they deserved acknowledgement. I tracked every single deposit I made into that account. Every amount, every date, every transaction reference. I kept records the same way I kept them for clients, in a spreadsheet backed up in 2 places with screenshots attached. I had not done this because I was planning something. I did it because tracking money is simply what I do. It is who I am. And now that habit was about to matter more than anything else in my life. The account was just the surface. Underneath it was a longer story my family had never told honestly. 3 years earlier, my father's hardware business nearly broke. A major supplier changed payment terms, 2 orders were cancelled, and his cash flow developed a serious gap. He didn't want a bank loan, so I quietly covered 2 months of payroll shortfalls through a private transfer. He said he would repay me when things stabilized. Things stabilized. He never mentioned it again. The year after that, Emily's furnace broke in January. She had just had her second child. Her husband Marcus's contracting work was slow in winter. She texted asking if I could help. I sent the money that morning. Then came my father's medical bills. Insurance covered most of his procedure but left a balance that triggered a collection notice. He was embarrassed. I paid it without involving anyone because it felt cleaner than watching him stress. Each moment lived separately in my memory. Together, in a spreadsheet, they told a completely different story. A story about a family whose financial stability had a silent backbone that had never been acknowledged, credited, or examined. They called me useless while standing on ground I had quietly kept from cracking beneath them. The comments had built over years. I had trained myself to let them pass without reacting, but they stayed with me regardless. Must be nice working from your couch. My father said that one Thanksgiving in front of everyone, while I was actually resolving a billing dispute for a client 3 time zones away. I smiled and passed the bread rolls. Still living like a student. That came from Uncle Warren at a summer cookout, looking at photos of my apartment. My apartment was clean, organized, and paid for entirely by me. But without a double garage, it apparently qualified as failure. Meanwhile, Emily's messages came in steadily. Can you spot me this month? My car registration is due. I sent the money. The kids have a school trip. Can you help? Covered it. Don't tell Dad, but I'm behind on the credit card and interest hits Friday. I sent it Thursday. She never paid me back. Not once, not a single dollar. After the 3rd time I noticed the pattern, I stopped expecting repayment and started documenting everything instead. Nobody ever noticed I was doing any of this. They were busy deciding what my life looked like from the outside to ask what it actually was. The moment everything changed didn't happen the night of the accusation. It happened months earlier, on a Thursday evening in late November. I had driven to drop off renewal paperwork my father needed for his business filing. The front door was unlocked as usual and I let myself in quietly. My father was in the kitchen. Emily was there too. I could hear both of their voices clearly from the hallway. My father's voice was low and easy. He said, "She won't fight back. She never does. That's the thing about Hannah. She absorbs it and goes quiet." Then Emily laughed. Not a cruel laugh. Comfortable one. The laugh of someone confirming something they had always known and felt safe saying out loud. I stood in that hallway for 4 seconds. Then I set the paperwork on the entry table and walked back to my car. I sat in the driveway with the engine off for a long time. What I felt was cleaner than anger and colder than sadness. It was clarity, The kind that only arrives when you hear the truth about how someone sees you, in their own voice, when they think you aren't listening. I drove home and opened a new spreadsheet. After that Thursday night, something shifted permanently in how I thought about my family. For years I had told myself a forgiving story. My father was under pressure and didn't always show gratitude well. Emily was younger and needed more support. The dynamic was complicated but not malicious. If I stayed patient, things would eventually balance. That story collapsed in the hallway the night I heard my father describe me like a system he had already solved. It wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't poor communication. It was a structure, deliberate, comfortable, unspoken, where I absorbed pressure and received nothing back except tolerance. My contributions were taken as expected. My presence was treated as optional. I was not failing my family. I had been supporting them financially and practically for years. And they had looked at that support and called it nothing. The decision I made that night was not dramatic. I didn't vow revenge or make speeches alone in my car. I simply decided to stop building my life around people who had concluded, out loud and in my absence, that I was someone to manage rather than love. And I decided that if they ever tried to make me the villain, I would be completely and thoroughly ready. Because I already had everything I needed. I spent the next 3 weeks doing what I do professionally. Organizing information. I pulled every bank statement going back 30 months. I cross-referenced dates with text messages. I captured every email thread where I had agreed to send money or cover a bill. I found the transfers to the shared emergency account. Every single one. I created a spreadsheet with 6 columns. Date, amount, recipient, purpose, confirmation number, and source documentation. Every row had all 6 fields filled. Nothing was estimated. Nothing was missing. I worked the same way I work for clients, without emotion, focused on accuracy. This was not about feeling something. It was about building something that could not be challenged. When I finished, I printed the complete document. 41 pages. I labeled the folder clearly in plain black letters. I organized the text messages separately. Emily's requests were the most numerous. I exported them chronologically and highlighted the ones where she had specifically asked me not to tell our father. There were 11 of those. I backed everything up to a secure drive. 1 physical copy stayed home. 1 went to my office. Then I waited. Because people who feel entitled always eventually reach for something they haven't earned. The total was $87,430. I stared at that number for a long time the night I finished. I got up, made tea, came back and looked at it again. It had not seemed large at the time because it came in portions spread across 30 months. Few hundred here. Few thousand there. Payroll gap in spring. A medical balance in fall. A quiet deposit on an ordinary Tuesday. None of those moments had felt enormous individually. Together they were more than many people earned in a full year. Money I had made through my own work and directed quietly toward a family that had never once asked how I was managing. Money that kept my father's business alive through its worst stretch. Money that kept Emily from serious crisis more than once. Money that kept the shared account funded every time it ran dangerously low. And these same people, my father with his chest out, Emily with her perfect tears, were calling me a thief. I closed the spreadsheet and went to bed. I slept better than I had in months. The number confirmed one thing clearly. They didn't have a case. I did. I had already started building my exit before the accusation ever happened. 4 months before that Sunday meeting, I accepted a new contract. A 2-year engagement with a logistics company 300 miles away. Better pay, more interesting work, and a location that gave me a clean reason to relocate without requiring anyone's opinion. I signed a lease on a new apartment in October. 4th floor. Good light. Near a park. I paid the deposit and first month's rent without telling anyone in my family. I moved belongings in small trips over 6 weeks, so nothing appeared sudden. Box of books one weekend. Bag of clothes the next. I kept my old apartment on paper through November, but by mid-November the new place had everything I actually needed. I updated my address with my bank, my clients, and my insurance. I told my close friends. I told no one in my family. My plan had nothing to do with any accusation. I was simply done. I had been done since that November night in the hallway. What I didn't know was that while I was quietly removing myself from their orbit, they were loudly building a story about me. And that story had already started spreading. By the time Aunt Carol called me on Friday afternoon, the story had already traveled far beyond my father's living room. Through my cousin Trey, who felt genuinely uncomfortable about all of it, I learned my father had told his version to at least 3 neighbors and 2 people from his church group. He framed it as a cautionary tale, a lesson about what happens when someone in the family goes wrong. "This is what you get," he reportedly said, "when you give access to someone who hasn't earned the trust." Neighbors who had known me since I was a teenager heard that. A couple from his church who had embraced me at my grandmother's funeral heard it too. He delivered the story like a man barely holding himself together for everyone else's sake. That was always the performance. What he didn't understand was that by spreading that version across his social circle, he was also building an audience, a room full of people who would eventually hear something very different from what he had told them. Aunt Carol's call was the invitation. She said we needed to resolve things properly as a family. Sunday. My father's house. When she used the word properly, I almost smiled. I told her Sunday worked perfectly. Aunt Carol called Friday evening and I spent no time debating whether to accept. "We need to sit down and resolve this properly as a family," she said, in the careful, smoothed-over voice she used when managing situations without appearing to choose a side. Sunday afternoon. Your father's house. Everyone wants to hear your side. I asked who would be there. She listed them: my father, Emily, Marcus, Uncle Warren, herself, and possibly a few others. She mentioned the extras casually, as if they barely mattered. They mattered entirely. I told her I would be there. She sounded relieved, which meant she had expected resistance. She didn't know that a full room was precisely what I needed. After I hung up, I printed a fresh copy of the full document. Then a second. I organized both in separate manila folders, paper-clipped in order with tabs separating sections. Account transfers. Personal transfers to Emily. Business support payments. Text message exports. I prepared a single summary page with key totals and dates, written simply enough for someone unfamiliar with financial records to follow in under 2 minutes. I set everything by the door before Saturday evening ended. The room thought it was ready for me. It wasn't. I arrived at my father's house on Sunday at exactly 2 in the afternoon. I wore a plain dark blue blouse and gray trousers. Nothing designed to impress. Nothing for effect. I wanted to look like what I was, someone there to address a factual matter. 4 cars sat in the driveway. Through the window I could already see people seated inside. Aunt Carol had arranged this carefully. The furniture was rearranged into a circle. Water glasses sat on the coffee table. My father stood near the window when I walked in. He smiled, not warmly but with confidence. The smile of a man certain this meeting would end with an apology in his favor. Emily sat on the sofa beside Marcus, who looked like he wanted to be anywhere else. Aunt Carol perched near the door. Uncle Warren stood with his coffee by the hallway. The Parkers, neighbors from 2 doors down, sat in chairs brought from the dining room. My father had ensured there was an audience. I nodded to the room, sat in the empty chair directly across from my father, and placed my folder flat on my knees. I didn't open it. My father's smile stayed in place. He had no idea what was inside that folder. My father didn't waste time. He never did when he believed the ground beneath him was solid. He sat, leaned forward with his hands clasped between his knees, and looked at me the way he looked at underprepared suppliers. "We've reviewed the account records," he said. "The withdrawals are consistent with your access window. The timing, the amounts. It all points one direction, Hannah." Emily pressed a tissue to the corner of her eye. Marcus stared at the table. "We're not here to attack you," my father continued, "which is exactly what people say when attacking is precisely what they intend. We need you to take responsibility. Own what happened. We'll work through everything else after. Uncle Warren made a low sound nearby. Just admit it, Emily said softly. Her voice carried the particular gentleness that had been working on our father since she was 9. It'll be much easier once you say it. They were waiting for me to break. I could feel the room leaning toward that outcome, hoping for it so everyone could call it resolved. I looked at the folder on my lap. Then I looked at my father calmly. Before I say anything, I told him, I'd like everyone to read something first. I slid the first folder across the coffee table toward my father. He picked it up with one hand, still relaxed, still the man in charge. Then he opened it. The first page was the summary sheet, a clean document titled, Financial Contributions to the Cole Family Account and Related Expenses. Below the title were totals broken into clear categories. Below those, one line. Full supporting documentation begins on page 2. He stopped. Not a long pause. Just a brief hesitation. The kind when what you're reading doesn't match what you expected to find. He turned to page 2. Aunt Carol, seated close enough to see the page edges, tilted her head slightly. Emily was watching our father's face rather than the document. Marcus had stopped staring at the table entirely. I handed the second copy to Uncle Warren, who accepted it without fully understanding why yet. Nobody spoke for 30 seconds. The certainty that had filled that room when I arrived, the assembled certainty built on 2 weeks of one-sided storytelling, was already beginning to loosen at its edges. Then, from Aunt Carol's direction, spoken softly and almost to herself, came the first crack in the room's confidence. Wait. My father reached page 4 and his expression changed. Page 4 was the transaction log for the shared emergency fund, the same account he had presented to people as evidence of my theft. The page showed 31 deposits made from my personal account over 27 months. Each entry listed a date, an amount, and a reference number. The total was in bold at the bottom. $31,200 contributed by Hannah Cole. Uncle Warren, reading the second copy, turned to that same page and went still. Emily's name appeared first on page 6, the personal transfer log. Each entry showed a date, amount, a brief description from her own text messages to me, and a confirmation number. Car registration, school trip, credit card interest, furnace repair, rent shortfalls, grocery emergency, Christmas expenses. 23 entries. Over $26,000 across 28 months. Her name appeared 23 times on that page. Aunt Carol had moved to stand behind my father's chair and read over his shoulder. When she reached Emily's section, she said nothing. She placed one hand on the back of the chair and kept reading. One neighbor, Mr. Parker, said quietly, "Is all of this actually documented?" The question already had its answer. It was right there on every page being passed across that room. Emily was the first to speak. "That's not what this is," she said. Her voice had shifted. The softness was still present, but something unsteady had moved underneath it. "You're taking things out of context. Those were just, you were helping, it wasn't supposed to be any kind of record." "No one said it was," I replied. She blinked. "I never called it a debt," I continued. "I documented it because that's what I do with money. Track it. That's my work. Not because I was planning anything. Because I don't let numbers disappear." My father turned another page without speaking. Emily tried again. "You're making it look like something it wasn't." "These aren't my documents," I said. "They are bank records and screenshots of your own text messages. They say what they say." Her voice thinned. "I always meant to pay you back." I didn't answer. Nothing useful could be added to that. Marcus placed his hand on her knee, less like comfort and more like someone reaching for something solid. Aunt Carol had returned to her chair, reading quietly. Her face was still, not shocked. More like someone finding the answer to a question she had been carrying for a long time. I set the text exports on the table. The text message exports were 12 pages long. My father picked them up without being asked. He read the first page, then the second. His breathing shifted slightly, the way breathing shifts when reading something that carries a real cost. The messages were dated and clear. Emily asking, me responding. Sometimes the same day, often within hours. Never a refusal. And woven through them was a separate thread of 11 messages where she had written some version of the same instruction. Don't tell Dad. Don't tell Dad I'm behind this month. Don't tell Dad things are tighter than I've let on. Don't tell Dad I borrowed from savings and need to replace it before he sees. Those 11 messages sat on the page like a confession written across many months in her own words. Emily had gone completely quiet. She stared at the wall, not at anyone. Marcus read 2 pages over my father's shoulder and sat back. Uncle Warren set his copy down and rubbed his neck. The Parkers hadn't spoken since the folders began circulating. They sat with hands folded, watching. My father was still reading. His expression had closed off entirely. The room had shifted from a gathering built to extract a confession into something closer to reckoning. He set the folder down on the coffee table slowly and with deliberate care. Then he looked at me. There was something unfamiliar in his face. Not his usual anger. I knew that expression in detail. This was quieter. The look of a man confronting something he didn't want to understand but could not find a way around. Why didn't you say anything? He asked. I held his gaze. Because you only listen when I'm wrong. The room didn't move. Nobody coughed or shifted or looked away. My father opened his mouth and then closed it. He looked down at the folder, then back up at me. For the first time in as long as I could remember, he had no immediate response. Emily was still staring at the far wall. Aunt Carol sat with both hands folded in her lap. Uncle Warren had the expression of a man replaying old conversations and arriving at conclusions he wished he could avoid. Nobody defended Emily. Nobody challenged me. Nobody reached for another angle to try. My father had stood before people 2 weeks earlier and told them this was a lesson about enabling. Now he was the one sitting in silence. No one was on their side. Time to finish what I had come to do. I stood up, deliberate and unhurried. I smoothed my blouse, picked up my bag, and looked directly at my father. I didn't steal from you, I said. He looked at the folder on the table. I waited 1 beat. I supported you. I let that land. For nearly 3 years I supported this family quietly, without a single word of acknowledgement. I covered gaps in your business twice. I handled Emily's emergencies more times than I can count. I kept that shared account funded every time it ran low. I looked at Emily. She was looking at her hands. I never wanted credit, I said. I didn't need celebration. I simply didn't expect to be called a thief in front of a room full of people. My father looked up. Something complicated lived in his expression I had never seen before. I picked up the copy from the table and tucked it under my arm. The second copy stays, I told the room. Read the rest when you're ready. Then I looked at my father one final time. I'm done. I walked through the living room, past Aunt Carol who reached one hand toward me, past the Parkers who looked at the floor, and out the front door into the cold afternoon air. I did not look back. The calls started before I reached the highway. My father called twice before I had driven 20 minutes. Then Emily. Then Aunt Carol. Then Uncle Warren, which surprised me because he had never once called me on his own. Then Emily again. Then my father 3 more times. I answered none of them. I turned the volume down and kept driving. Over the following days, my cousin Trey sent updates. The practical fallout was arriving from several directions at once. Emily had been depending on me to cover a quarterly payment to a storage facility. She assumed it would process automatically, the way everything always had. When it didn't, she discovered the card on file was mine and had been removed. My father's shared business software, quietly renewed under my email each year, had lapsed. 2 years of archived client records were suddenly unreachable. The emergency account sat at its real balance for the first time. Nearly empty because no one else had ever meaningfully contributed. 3 regular bills had been forwarding to my old address and handled by me silently. That stopped too. Each thing was small alone. Together, they all delivered the same message. I had been the operating system running in the background. Nobody knew until I stopped. The voicemail I almost didn't play came on a Thursday morning, 12 days after the meeting. My father's voice was different from any version I had grown up with. Not the commanding voice he used for business. Not the practiced disappointment he aimed at me for years. Not the cold formal tone from Sunday. Just his actual voice. Muller. Stripped of its usual structure. "Hannah," he said. "It's Dad. I've been thinking. I need to talk to you. Not about the account. Just, I need to talk to you." He did not say sorry. He said he needed to talk. In my family, those were entirely different things. My father had never admitted to needing anything from me emotionally since I was 12. He asked for things practically. He expected things structurally. I listened twice. Not because I was softening. Because I wanted to hear it as the thing it was. A man in a quieter house than usual, finally feeling a weight he had spent years unknowingly transferring to someone else. He hadn't said sorry. Just need. I set the phone face down and made breakfast. The life I had chosen was waiting on the other side of all this. It did not need his apology to begin. I finished setting up my new apartment in early December. The 4th-floor place with the good morning light. The coffee shop 2 blocks away where I went on Tuesdays and Thursdays. Nobody there knew my family or my history or the story of one Sunday afternoon that unraveled 2 decades of quiet. My work was good. The new contract demanded the best of me, the kind that sharpens rather than drains. My clients respected what I did because results lived on a spreadsheet. My value didn't need to be argued for. I heard through Trey that Emily had taken a part-time bookkeeping job and was managing genuinely better. I was glad. I had never needed anyone to suffer. I heard my father was working with a business consultant, something he'd resisted for years. Progress even at a distance. And Carol sent a card. Just a short note. She was proud of me and sorry she hadn't said so sooner. I put it on the shelf above my desk. I never needed them to fall. I needed them to feel the weight of what they had been handing to me without ever realizing it. I was never the one they carried. I was the one holding them up. And the moment I let go, they finally felt it.